Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Carlson. I am the chair of the CTS Transportation Planning and Economy Council. Today, I'm also a transportation planning engineer with Kimley Horn. And today you are joining us for our Planning and Economy Council webinar, as well as our council meeting. We are recording this event today, and we will post the video recording on our CTS event page for anyone who can view it after today's event. We'll also post the presentation slides for those who want to follow along. Vice Chair Lisa Austin is also with us today. Lisa, would you like to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thank you, Mary. So I am Lisa Austin with MnDOT in the Center for Community Connections, and I'm very happy to be the new vice chair, I guess for a few months now with Mary, and looking forward to working with the councils. Thanks.
Thanks for being here today, Lisa. And then Gina Boss and Katie Kirk from CTS are also with us on today's webinar and here supporting us. So thank you so much, Gina and Katie, for being here. As many of you know, the CTS councils provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. We bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. In the chat, Katie will share a link to council information. Please feel free to look at that and to let us know if you have any questions and would like to discuss. And we welcome heartily your participation in our council activities. Today's agenda, we are featuring a presentation by Camila Fonseca, Director of Fiscal Studies at the Institute of Urban and Regional Infrastructure Finance at the university's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Camila's presentation is on local contributions to state and regional transportation facilities in Minnesota. Following the presentation today, there will be time for audience question and answer. And then we'll finish, since this is a council meeting today, with what we call a round robin, where we give all of you opportunities to share with the group things that you're hearing and thinking about in terms of planning and economy. Before we get into our full agenda today, Lisa, can you walk us through some of our housekeeping items?
Absolutely, thanks a lot, Mary. I'm really excited about this presentation. We've had a little chance to chat with Camilla over the last couple of weeks, and I've read her report, and I think we'll all have some really interesting questions after we've seen this. So the best way to address questions and answers, if you notice at the bottom of your screen, Zoom has a Q&A tab. So if you put your questions in the Q&A, it'll make it easier for us to keep track of questions and answers that we'll bring up at the end of the presentation. And then, as Mary mentioned, after we've had a Q&A, we'll do our round robin. So you can be thinking about what you'll want to share. And this is anything that might be interesting to this council on planning and the economy. So think about what's going on in your organizations or trends that you're starting to see. And that's a really important aspect of the council meetings, that we keep our fingers on the pulse of issues that are facing our region. So once we get to that round robin section, we will have you put your comments in chat or ask for us to call on you in the chat. So we'll remind you of that at the end, but use Q&A for questions on the presentation and save your ideas for round robin to put in the chat. And then I'll just share with you, we do offer professional development credit hours for AICP, and you can see on the those credits sent you, just put your name in the chat and we'll make sure we email you the forms. So a couple of upcoming events. On March 2nd, there's another exciting presentation on multimodal applications for destination access. So if you haven't already registered for that seminar, that's put on by another one of the CTS councils, the Transportation Safety and the Traffic Flow Research Council. So that's another great one to attend. So I encourage you to look at that one. And there'll be one last joint council presentation yet to be determined in the spring. That'll be on the CTS Energy Environment, and the Transportation Council will, and the Infrastructure Council will have another one. So watch for that in your mailboxes. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mary.
Thanks so much, Lisa. All right, getting into our presentation today, just giving a little bit more background information. With federal and state revenue not keeping up with our transportation needs, local government contributions for the roadway system have increased in recent years. This includes local spending on trunk highways through cooperative agreements, which can improve trunk highways that are part of local transportation systems, but that also limit the ability of local governments to then address the needs on their own roadways. Today's presentation will feature a review of the results of case studies and a survey distributed to Minnesota County and City transportation engineers. These results show that while cooperative agreements can be mutually beneficial for both local and state governments, they also carry the risk of unexpected costs for local governments. So local governments should be aware of the risks of entering into cooperative agreements, particularly when state funding totals are capped. In addition, effective communication during planning and construction can mitigate many of the risks of cost increases, as well as uncertainties around cost coverage by MnDOT. Camila Fonseca is the Director of Fiscal Studies at the Institute for Urban and Regional Infrastructure Finance at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. At the Institute, she's engaged with research related to fiscal arrangements for transportation, capital budgeting for transportation, and impact analysis of transportation investments. Thank you so much for being here today, Camila.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much all of you for being here today with us. Today I will be presenting the results of our research on the local contributions to state and regional transportation facilities in Minnesota. This research was conducted between 2018 and 2019 by my colleagues at the Institute of Urban and Regional Infrastructure Finance, Rayhana Sirak, Nate Bean, and Professor Jerry Zhao. This research was also sponsored by the local Road Research Board, LRRB. So as is known, federal and state governments have had challenges keeping up with transportation needs. These challenges affect funding for the roadway system, including the share of funding that goes into local governments. Currently, there's limited research on how these challenges affect the share that local governments spend on state and regional highway infrastructure. So this research aims to fill that gap by assessing the contribution of local expenditures to state and regional transportation facilities in Minnesota. So federal and state funding make up a significant portion of the Minnesota transportation budget, but local transportation funding is the single largest contributor, accounting for around almost 40% of the total funding. As we see in this graph, between 2008 and 2017, the federal contributions declined slightly, while the state contributions were pretty much stable, a little bit increasing. And local contributions, on the other hand, have been increasing probably since around 2010. When we zoom into the federal and state contributions, particularly in the main revenues that are the federal and the state motor fuel taxes, the registration tax, and the motor vehicle sales tax, we see that revenues have been growing, but that growth has been decreasing, and that you see in the graph, in the curvature at the end of the period. Notice also that the overall increase is driven by the registration tax and the motor vehicle sales tax. For future years, MnDOT projects a budget shortfall. In particularly, they estimate having a 53% of the funding they need to meet their 2017 and 2037 state highway goals. Much of the challenges to keep up with transportation needs are associated with the motor fuel tax. Although the state motor fuel tax has remained the single largest source of the state revenue, we observe that it has decreased as a share of total dedicated highway revenues. So here in the graph, you see that dark blue portion as a share of the total has been decreasing over the years. Inflation, the increase of road construction, improved vehicle efficiency, and the alternative energy sources are frequently cited as main factors that jeopardize the ability of the motor fuel tax to generate enough revenue to maintain the transportation system. And this is of particular concern for local governments. In this graph, we show the average revenue across all local governments, so counties, cities, and townships between 2 5-year periods. So this kind of smooths out the funding that they have had during the period. So the first panel shows the average between 2008 and 2012. And the second panel shows the average between 2013 and 2017. And as we see, state funding provides almost 50% of county funding for both periods, while local efforts made up to like 38% of each period. Here, when we refer to local efforts, we're referring to own source revenue that consists of property taxes, special assessment, sales taxes, and other miscellaneous revenues. And for some counties that also include a village tax, I believe like around 54 counties have a village tax, the local option sales tax, I believe like around 46 counties have that local option sales tax. And some other counties also receive funding, well, counties and some cities also receive funding from the gravel tax. Notice that funding for transportation in cities and in townships mostly came from their own source revenues. And also note that for townships, they do not receive any federal funding. And that state grants have been increasing for all counties, cities, and townships. So local governments are in charge of building and maintaining the roads that are under their jurisdiction, but they can also contribute to trunk highways as these are very important this is a very important part of the local roadway system. So it is important here to mention that trunk highways are under the state jurisdiction, but still local governments may fund the construction of highway features that meet local roadway needs, like street landscaping or like participating in trunk highway construction that create mutual benefits for local and regional systems. So given the limitations in the federal and state funding, it is crucial to understand the contributions that local governments put on the state and regional transportation facility, and as well as like the challenges that they face when doing so. So local governments may contribute to the trunk highway improvements through cooperative agreements with MnDOT. This cost sharing for this type of projects is guided by MnDOT cost participation policy that outlines some standards for the appropriate division of the cost of the project between MnDOT and the local government. So MnDOT's participation is typically limited to fund the items that it considers necessary for the trunk highway, given that the trunk highway funds are constitutionally restricted for the trunk highway system. There is a manual that is available that determines the MnDOT's participation in the cooperative projects based on the Constitution, the shared benefits on the trunk highway system, and the scope of the project, which should be consistent with the priorities that are established in the Highway Investment Plan or MnCHIP. So this manual presents the participation for construction and maintenance activities and provides MnDOT maximum participation amount by categories. So it provides like a detail for roads, interchange, lighting, and signage. Typically, the manual mentions that MnDOT maximum participation is up to 100%, but the actual participation might be less. So typically, when the construction project has both trunk highway and local purposes, and the responsibility is not easily assigned to MnDOT or to a local government, the costs are assigned based on the basis of the jurisdictional ownership. This type of projects may be initiated by MnDOT, who requests local participation in a trunk highway project, or they can also be initiated by the local government that ask for improvements in their portion of the trunk highway, and they indicate their willingness to share the cost, or request MnDOT participation in a local initiated project. In all cases, the participation of the Department of Transportation must be commensurate with the benefits accruing to the trunk highway system. And well, these type of agreements are beneficial to both parties, but they can also be a source of additional cost for local governments. So there are some cases in which local governments perceive that they have contributed a significant portion of their funding for these trunk highway improvements. So in order to understand the cost burden on local governments from these cooperative agreements, we conducted 6 case studies of cities and counties. The table that I have here in my slides shows the selected studies. So these studies were selected based on recommendations for the technical advisory panel that we have for the research project. And we tried to have cases that included different elements in the construction. So we can see if there were like some variations in how the costs were shared. So from this list, we have reconstruction improvements on the road, like highway expansion. We also have the construction of an interchange, the construction of a bridge, improving intersections and a roundabout, and some lighting and signal construction. All of the information for these case studies was retrieved from documents provided by the local governments, and that includes the cooperative agreement between MnDOT and the local government, internal budgeting documents, some records from the city council and county wards. And we also complemented this information through interviews with staff from each local government that had knowledge about these specific cases. So here I'm going to discuss the overall findings, and I will touch on specific aspects of some of the case studies, but I'm not going to go very in deep into each of the case studies. So as I mentioned, cooperative agreements can create important benefits for the parties involved on the roadway system. They expand the available funding for trunk highway projects, and they improve coordination between of the state road network. These agreements also allow local governments to make desired improvements that otherwise will not be like a state priority. In addition, many local governments took advantage of these reconstruction projects, like these big reconstruction projects, to replace their own existing infrastructure. So that includes water and sewer systems. Also to upgrade sidewalks so that they are compliant with, they're ADA compliant. And in all of these additional features kind of improve the benefits to the community, provide benefits of the local community, and also the businesses that are in the area. Well, second, in most of the cases, the distribution of the estimated costs were according to the agreement, but we cannot say the same for the unforeseen costs. So there were some cases. So there were some cases in which the local government experienced unforeseen costs. Those were the ones who caused additional burdens to the local governments. So there were some cases in which they experienced an increased cost after the state funding was determined. And most of these additional costs were due to like changes in the scope of the project, or given like the low estimates of the project cost, or simply because like there were unexpected costs that appear here in each project. There were some issues related to some funding sources. So in particular, we refer here to the SIMS grants that were capped. So that contributed also to the financial burden that some of the cases that is selected suffer. So here, let me provide some examples. I will refer to 3 case studies, but some of the challenges that I will discuss here I are kind of shared by some of the other case studies. So in Red Wing, for instance, the reconstruction of the main street was planned. The city received some funds for the project through the SIMS grant in 2013. And this, as I mentioned, this fund is capped. So that means that the amount doesn't change at all, even if the cost increase. Later in 2014, the cost increased because MnDOT told the city that they had to use like a specific material for the reconstruction. So instead of using concrete, no, they had to use concrete instead of using bituminous. And this add a lot to the cost. So based on the information we received, well, we need to add to this that the lowest bid came at 21% higher than they were expecting. And one of the reasons of this higher bid was that the city used average statewide construction costs to inform the initial estimate. And in the actual project involved like a more complex urban construction. And according to me, that the original estimate was very low and the bids were reasonable. So given this increased cost, MnDOT did increase a little bit of their funding to account for higher the anticipated cost, but only for the uncapped items. So the city bore all the additional costs that were usually like a state responsibility. So after a lot of negotiations, MnDOT offered Red Wing additional funding, and that created a split of 60% for the state and 40% for the city of the additional costs of this trunk highway project. The other case study that I was going to refer here was with St. Paul. So in this case study, the road was in serious disrepair, and that was affecting negatively like businesses and like people in the area. And the road was not a high priority for MnDOT, as this was like a minor arterial, and they typically like prioritize funding for other projects, and they tend to focus a little bit more in like primary major arterials. So the city went ahead and secured some federal funding, and later also secured some state funding. So for one of the phases of the project, the estimated construction cost increased 25% in a lapse of a 2-year period. And later the bids came like 10 million higher than they were anticipated. The city rejected that proposal and went for another rebid, and that final rebid was also a little bit higher than expected, but lower than the 10 million that they were receiving the first time. So they decided to go with that proposal. And then the cost of the project also increased due to the acquisition of right of way needed for the project. So the city anticipated that they will have to pay around like 3 million for that, but actually the cost increased to 10 million. The city incurred in all of the expenses related to right of way expenses, and states that should have been MnDOT's responsibility. And MnDOT says that they will have completed the project within the existing right of way, and they will have avoided those additional costs. But the city said that they needed that right of way expansion to kind of to fulfill some terms of the federal funding that they receive for the project. As we see, well, West St. Paul had to deal with a lot of like unforeseen costs, and much of those increases were due to like changes in project scope that were not defined when they kind of signed the contract. Or like not the same contract, but like once they have received like the federal funding. Overall, the city estimates that they pay for like 63% of the repairs that were state responsibility. And of all the contribution that the city put into this project, 80% was financed by debt. So that debt is still going on, and they project to pay that debt by 2034. And the last case study is, well, that I'm going to refer here is Rochester. So in Rochester, we are talking about the construction of an interchange. The construction was entirely absorbed by the city because it was considered that it was more beneficial to the local road than to the actual highway. And that was consistent with the cost participation policy. The city mentioned that they borrowed the cost associated, and they funded all of the project through a half-cent local sales tax. Finally, in all of the cases, they mentioned that communication between MnDOT and the local government was determinant for the project's success. So for instance, in the case of Egan, they mentioned that like good communication in the planning and the construction stages kind of make this work to be successful compared to like previous projects that they have had. In the case of Red Wing, they mentioned that more effective communication between MnDOT and the city will have lessened the unexpected costs related to the concrete requirement. And in the case of Duluth, I didn't mention Duluth, but Duluth was very similar. They also received SIMS funds, like the grant, that was also cut. So they mentioned that the communication between that local government and MnDOT could have mitigated some of the uncertainty around the items that were covered or not covered through this grant. And overall, we observed that communication between the two parties it's like a key important aspect that can mitigate these additional costs that local governments kind of bear in this project. So later, to understand better the experiences of these local government with these cooperative agreements, we developed a survey that was distributed to the city and county engineers through an email list. So here I'm citing those email lists. We received help from the project coordinator from MnDOT to distribute the survey. Most of the information that we gather from the case study kind of help us inform the questionnaire that we use in the survey. We ask questions related to like the agency itself, but also like their involvement in the cooperative agreements, their experiences with their expenses, and the factors that will improve these cooperative projects. The survey was anonymous. And we received a total of 80 responses, but we only analyzed 78 because 2 of the responses were empty, so we removed them from the analysis. So finally, we analyzed 37 responses from counties and 42 cities. So if we look into like the response rate, that means that we received 43% of the counties and 5% of the cities. That percentage of response rates for the cities is very small, but it could be probably because there are a lot of like small cities and they do not engage in cooperative agreements with MnDOT. So that could be an explanation. Okay, so the majority of the cities were located in the 7-county metro area, and most of the counties were located in greater Minnesota. Of the cities that we have here, 32 were like small urban cities, so like populations with less than 50,000 people, and 9 were larger urban cities with populations with higher, with more than 50,000 people. So overall, we see that 74% of the respondents participated in a cooperative agreement for trunk highway projects, and well, later I will come back to that 26% that did not participated. The percentage of respondents who participated in a cooperative agreement was very similar across counties and cities. And most of these agencies have participated in like a small number of cooperative projects. So as we see here, like 46% and 36% participated in only one project. Then followed by those who have like at least two projects. And we only saw like 3 counties that have like more than 10 projects, but these were very like unusual. We were particularly interested in those local governments that had cooperative projects in something that we call trunk highway core capacity. So particularly because the costs of these projects are shared between the state and the local government. So when we when we refer to these trunk highway core capacity projects, we refer to those expenses that are only related to the trunk highway and do not include common elements that are understood to be like under the responsibility of local governments, such as like utilities and improvements in like local roads. So it's only a kind of the expenditures on the truck highway. More than 60% of the agencies that participated in a cooperative agreement were involved in trunk highway projects related to core capacity. Most of those who have participated in only one project have had projects related to the trunk highway core capacity. And those who have participated in like multiple projects have participated also not only like in the core capacity, but also like in local roads. And we also noticed that there is a higher percentage of cities that mention some work on the utilities. And as I mentioned, we were very particularly interested in the local governments that had trunk highway core capacity projects. And in this sample, we got a total of 15 counties and 23 cities that had these types of projects. And we asked them additional questions to them. So as I mentioned before, the trunk highway cooperative projects can be initiated by MnDOT or the local government. So we included a question related to that. And we also asked if there were if they perceive any differences between projects initiated by MnDOT and projects initiated by local agencies. So most of the agencies that have participated in only one project were invited by MnDOT, while those who have participated in more than 2 projects mentioned that they have also initiated their projects. About 2/3 of the respondents perceived that there were important differences depending on who the initiator of the project was. So here I'm presenting some of the comments that we received in the survey related to project priority and the interaction with MnDOT. But overall, the responses that we received mentioned that they perceive a lot of like different, like important differences in terms of like project management, project execution, the cost participation, funding sources, project priority, and the interaction with MnDOT. During the case studies, we also found that the funding for these type of projects come from like a mix of federal, state, and local funding. So we asked respondents to show like what were the main funding sources for these type of projects. And as we see here in this graph, the most important sources were local sources and state trunk highway funds. Cities rely mainly on local funding, which again includes like general funds, bonding, some utility funds. They also mention like tax increment financing, or like TIF, transportation sales tax, or like internal funds that they have designated for roadway. Like only a third of the cities mentioned that they relied on the MSA funds, which are the municipal state aid street funds. And counties, on the other hand, seem to rely equally on state and local funding. All of the counties that mentioned that they were using funding sources, they relied on CASA funds, or like the county state aid highway fund. Other funding included federal grants that typically require like a machine requirement, and other state grants. These were like most of them like managed by MnDOT, but they also mentioned some others that were managed by administered by the Department of Economic Employment and Development, DEET. So they refer to the Transportation Economic Development Program, TED program, and the TEDI program, which is some Transportation Economic Development infrastructure. In addition, we asked them about like if they have experienced any increased costs. Less than half of the participants mentioned that they did experience costs. So like that was like 46% for counties and 36% for cities. And the percentage of local governments that have experienced those additional costs was higher among those who have had multiple cooperative agreements. So for counties, the two primary factors that caused those additional costs were project work and much higher than expected bids. And for cities, the additional costs were due to unexpected project work and also changes in the scope of the project. Other kind of causes of increased costs were related to right-of-way costs, additional work required by MnDOT, and additional design costs due to the process, like MnDOT, the process that is required by MnDOT. We asked them like how these costs were shared among states, the state, like MnDOT, and the local agency. So here the table that I'm presenting presents that breakdown. And we see that there is a higher number of responders that say that the local government paid for the additional costs. Only in one of the cases, they mentioned that they had to pay for those costs because they weren't covered in the initial agreement. But in the other cases, they didn't provide a lot of explanation for this. And some others mentioned that they did split the costs. Some of them mentioned that they split the cost based on the initial agreement. Some of them mentioned that it was 50-50. And some others mentioned that it depends on the additional work or the way that the contract was written. They also mentioned that to pay for this additional cost, they reallocated funds, but they didn't mention like from where, or like where did they have to like cut expenses so that they can finance this project. And they also mentioned that they use like additional revenues coming from increments in the taxes, or coming from like financial schemes like bonding or like tax increment financing. Yeah, well, to cover those additional costs. We also asked them about the factors that could improve the trunk highway cost sharing, like cooperative agreements. The respondents considered that well, the important factors were the availability of contingency funds to fund those increases in costs, as well as communication between MnDOT and the local agencies. When we compared the responses we got from the cities and the counties, the cities believe that the availability of contingency funds is more important, while counties favor more like improved communication. In addition, some of the respondents from counties also mentioned that they would like to have like more clarity about the potential risks of these cooperative projects, especially the additional cost, and more clarity in how these responsibilities are shared for each party. Other factors that were mentioned include like the flexibility around the like projects that are initiated by local agencies, less MnDOT bureaucracy, and increased MnDOT contribution. So here they were referring more to like a payment of a fair share. Well, since better communication was very important in the case studies, we also included a question about like what could improve those communications. So the majority of the respondents considered timely communication. So that includes timely follow-up and check-ins, and early notification of project costs that had to be paid by the local agencies. Other factors mentioned include the clarity on who's responsible for those additional costs, the flexibility to adjust costs after receiving the bids, clarity about the additional work that is required by MnDOT, transparency, and MnDOT willingness to adapt to change. Well, I mentioned before that we had like 26% of our survey responses did not participate in cooperative agreement. So most of them mentioned that they didn't participate in those because they didn't need to participate, or because they didn't have enough funding. We also asked them about like the willingness to participate in future cooperative agreements. And we noticed that cities were more likely than counties to participate. And they mentioned that the lack of coordination between the state and the local agencies, the lack of local funding, the difficulty of dealing with MnDOT, and no feeling the need to participate as main reasons for not participating. In addition, several counties and cities mentioned that it was very hard to obtain state funding due to the burdensome process. So based on the case studies that we developed and the survey responses that we got, we noticed that cooperative agreements are mutually beneficial for both the state and local governments, but they can also create like additional risks related to unexpected costs increases for local governments. So we developed these 6 recommendations to kind of improve the cooperative agreements. So the first one is to disclose project requirements during the planning phase. So all of the project requirements should be available for MnDOT and the local government, so that they can create more accurate and comprehensive budgets, and they can like plan for those specific kind of details. So here we're saying like, I don't know, the specific materials that they have to use, or like the specific project timeline. So those things those details have to be disclosed. There should be also like more discussion about like the funding condition of state funds and grants. So this is particularly due to the SIMS grants that were capped. Those created a lot of financial burden to some local governments. And also referring to like the specific requirements that need to be addressed due to the federal grants. So kind of talking into those points and can help MnDOT and the local government to better plan and budget for the project. The third one will be to include the distribution of unexpected costs in the contract. So as we see, like most of the expected costs are shared based on the policy that MnDOT has, but there isn't a lot of like information or clarity regarding like those unexpected costs. How are they going to, like, who's responsible for what? So that could be something that could be included in the agreement. And well, that can also help to plan better for contingencies and like kind of inform the decision making for local governments and MnDOT as well. The fourth recommendation will be to maintain regular communication between MnDOT and government. So that, like, communication is kind of key to better coordinate and better plan for unforeseen events. The fifth recommendation will be to enable the use of state contingency funds to share the unexpected costs. And then the last recommendation will be, well, to track the spending, the local spending on the trunk highway system, because right now this data wasn't kind of easily available. And yeah, so those are our recommendations. So now I will open to discussion, some questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Camilla. I'll help facilitate the Q&A. So as a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box, or if you want to verbally state your question, just mention that in the Q&A box too. You say I have a question and I'll call on you. So I'll just pause here for a minute to see if anybody types anything in, and then if not, I've got a couple of questions I can ask Camilla. So pause for a moment. All right, well, as people are formulating their questions, I guess the first one I have, Camilla, is I know we were trying to invite the project champion to the meeting, and he had a conflict. That was Russ Mathis, is that right, from Egan? And I know it'll be interesting to hear, I know your thoughts on why he put the problem statement in, and I think there were some surprise findings. So I don't know if you can share a little bit about what you think he would have said if he were here.
Well, from the comment he made, it seems that they were thinking of this project. They expected different results from this project, and this kind of completely like shaped his mind about the cooperative agreements. But I don't know specifically like the details of that.
So one of the case studies was in Egan. Was that one of the ones he recommended to study then?
Yeah.
Maybe can you share a little bit about what that project was and what the findings were then, or if you don't have that handy, that's fine. I can go on to another question, but
yeah. Well, I don't have it in top of my mind, but they. Yeah, I remember that at the end he mentioned like, yeah, all the costs were shared kind of based on the agreement. So that one wasn't like we didn't find a lot of like increased costs. That was what I recalled. At least all the costs were based on the agreement. Okay. He did mention that the communication was crucial during the planning stage and the construction stage. So it seems that they have had like different projects with MnDOT, and he was comparing these to other projects, and that was kind of a key for the success of that project.
Great. And he did say in an email that if anyone had any questions about the project, he'd be happy to answer them. So if you're interested, we can provide his contact information if anyone wants to talk to him about why he put the problem statement in or any details. So we did have a question about when if the slides are going to be available, and I think those will be on the CTS website. And I don't know, Katie, if you can put in the chat box a link to the research project, because people might also be interested in reading the full report as well. I know I got a lot out of reading the report in addition to seeing the slides. All right, so we do have a question up in the Q&A from Kevin, and it says, does MnDOT require local financial participation from local governments in projects not on the freeway system?
Well, I don't know if this is related to like the cooperative agreements that are between some counties and the cities. But I don't think MnDOT requires them to do that. So here we're referring to the cooperative agreements that are kind of the kind of shared cost in the trunk highway that are specifically responsibility of MnDOT. But as I mentioned, local governments can fund some of that features. Yeah, but I don't know if they are on the freeway system. Yeah, I don't know if that answers his question.
Yeah, Kevin, if that doesn't answer your question, just type in a little clarifying or additional follow-up question and we'll try to address it. I do see in the chat, Philip Bergam has some insights he'd be willing to share about his experiences. So Philip, are you able to unmute yourself or do we need to do that? Does Katie need to do that?
I can go ahead and unmute Phil. Just a moment here.
Okay.
I think he's unmuted.
Yeah, I think I'm there. Not so much being able to give insight in the middle of this, but I'm talking about if you want to talk to me offline at a different time.
Okay.
Of course, we're constantly in the middle of cooperative agreement projects. We'll have 15 projects we're working on at any given time in the metro area. But we've done the majority of cooperative agreements across the state. Most of them are coming out of the metro area, and we've got good relationships with all the metro counties, many of the metro cities. Sometimes things go awry, and that frustrates us as much as it frustrates the locals. But yeah, we'd be glad to talk with you about some of this offline if you want to. I've provided my email address, and we can do set up some times. One thing that I will mention is the difficulty that we have. One thing that you pointed out in the discussion was, it'd be very helpful to lay out what the expectations are, talk about the scope beforehand, talk about the expectations where money is, stuff like that. Projects that don't go through the local participation program, the LPP process, if the locals get federal money, a lot of times there's a lot of background information that happens before I'm made aware of the project. So that gets very difficult to start saying, well, this is what you can spend it on, this is what you can't spend it on. These are some of the areas of where we anticipate difficulties. so yeah, communication is always vital. Sometimes it's easier to have that communication than other times.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I appreciate your being willing to weigh in. And that's a good discussion of that communication being important both ways, you know, as local governments and MnDOT learn about things in advance to keep each other informed and communicate.
Yeah,
we have another, Philip has, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. One of the projects that was listed as an example was the West St. Paul, Robert Street project. And I know from MnDOT's standpoint, that's started off as a median closure project. And the city decided they wanted to make it into the gateway of the city, the center point, the focal point of the city. And that was an exercise in scope creep and difficult expectations. And when all was said and done, the city thought that MnDOT hadn't contributed enough, whereas we'd contributed a great amount. And they're very disappointed in many things. It's a great project, but there were a lot of difficulties in that one. Anyway, I'll be quiet now and let other people chat.
Great. Thanks for that additional insight.
Yeah, as I mentioned in that project, like 80% of the costs were financed through debt. And that's a debt that they still are paying. They hope to pay that by 2034. So that's creating a lot of like financial burden in the city.
And that was all stuff that was added at the request of the city. None of it benefited MnDOT, but it made it for a beautiful roadway through the city.
Great, thank you. All right, we have another question from another Philip here. So Philip Schaffner writes, he was part of the when MnDOT updated the cost participation policy in 2016. So in some of the survey questions or any of the interviews, did anybody bring up the changes from 2016 and talking about did they see that see any improvements from before 2016 or after? Was there any reference to that?
Yeah, no, we didn't have any reference to that change. We, like in our literature review, we noticed that that the cost participation policy changed. So I believe before that change, the split of the cost was kind of like 60-40, and now they were hoping that locals contributed like 10% of the cost. Like, so they kind of decreased the burden that was going for local governments. But no, in any of our case studies or like in the surveys, that was not mentioned.
Great, thank you. So I thought of another question. You'd mentioned in the slides that some of the local governments faced challenges in raising local funds. Did you, in any of the surveys or interviews, find out what some of those challenges are? Like, I mean, I can make some assumptions that it's on, population size or other factors in a city or county, but can you share any insights that you discovered?
Well, like for the funding that goes specifically into these trunk highway projects, they did mention that they had to reallocate some of the funds, but they never kind of clarified like specifically which funds they move. Some of them mentioned that they use like utility funds to cover kind of the cost associated to like changes in their utilities. Well, as I mentioned, in West St. Paul, they mentioned that to pay for those costs, they have to issue some bonds. So right now they have to pay for those. And in the case of Rochester, they did pay for those additional costs through their local option sales tax. Yeah, and through the survey, they mentioned that they increased some taxes. They also use tax increment financing and bonds, but there wasn't like anything like very like specific, or like they didn't provide a lot of like details into that.
How about how about in the survey for the 26 respondents that said they didn't use cost participation agreements? Did they talk about any of the reasons why it was hard to raise local funds?
No. They mentioned that they didn't participate in truck cooperative projects due to the lack of funding, but they didn't mention like the reasons behind that.
Well, thank you. So any more questions? I don't see any more people asking questions in the Q&A box. How about Mary, Katie, or Gina? Do you have any questions?
Camilla, this is Mary. One of the questions that I love to ask is were you surprised by anything? Earlier we had shared that, Russ shared with us, which I really appreciate, that he was surprised by the findings, and it really changed the way that he was thinking about cooperative agreements. Are there anything that was, were there any things that was a surprise to you as researchers?
Yeah, I would say it's like every project is so unique, and they have like different features that it's very hard. Kind of like when answering the question, like how much they contribute, it's so hard because as you see, like they say like, oh, this was probably a responsibility that was going to be kind of paid by MnDOT, but we ended up paying. But then MnDOT says like, well, they had to pay that because they added these additional features, or because let's say they had to pay for like right-of-way access, that if we do the project, we didn't have to do like to incur into those additional costs. So yeah, like I found that like very like interesting, kind of hearing the perspective from the different parties involved into the project itself. Yeah, and I believe there was like also another question that you made, that like what were the benefits to these local governments for these projects, and we mentioned like, well, we didn't see like we didn't go that deep into like what were the benefits. They did mention that they benefited from like having roadway improvements that otherwise they wouldn't have had. Kind of that they like they use this opportunity to change the all existing infrastructure that they had in their communities, and also like update their sidewalks to ADA compliance. And right now we're doing another research project in which we're trying to see like what are the economic benefits for these small cities that have kind of these kind of projects. We're also like tying that to like the complete streets approach, and that's something that we will want to see like in the future. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
So one more question I have. So of the case studies you did, which one was the best fit for the cost participation or the cooperative agreements? And which one was the most challenging for the cooperative agreement? And then, describe a little bit about what the features were in the project, or what the type of the project.
Yeah, let's say of the three cases that I explained, they were like Red Wing and West St. Paul were kind of the most challenging because they had a lot of like project going on and like different costs associated to that. The other ones, they didn't seem to have a lot of problems, and they mentioned that they did share the cost based on the agreement. So those ones were like probably a little bit more light there, but yeah, definitely the ones in the city of Red Wing and West St. Paul.
Great, thanks. Well, we're getting close to the amount of time we allocated for Q&A, so if I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box, we might go ahead and start our round robin. So I'll pause for a few seconds here to say going once, going twice. Any last questions? All right. With that, I'll pass it back to Mary to facilitate our round robin. And again, if you could chat some interesting things that are happening in your organization or observations that you have in the region that you think would be good topics for future research or current research that you're working on. We'd love to share out topics that fall under this council's topic of transportation planning and the economy. So please share.
All right, I see that Lee has his hand raised. So Lee, can you give us an update?
Hi, yes, I'm Lee Munich from the Humphrey School. We have a project going on under our Transportation Policy and Economic Competitiveness Program. Actually, there are three areas, and one of those is finance that Camila is involved in. Another is related to technology that focuses on autonomous vehicles. And then an area that I'm working on related to industry clusters and supply chain issues. We're currently looking at the medical device industry, and we've been doing that now for a couple of years. And with COVID, it's of course raised a lot more supply chain issues for the healthcare industry in general. So we've been working with multiple organizations, and we're currently doing some interviews with companies involved in medical technologies to learn more about the supply chain issues and some of the implications for coming out of the pandemic, what kinds of things may have to change, the role that particularly the airport plays in medical supply chains, as well as what kinds of policies going forward MnDOT should be looking at. So this is a project we're doing, and at some point, it might be good to give a report on that project, you know, maybe next fall or something like that might be a good time to do that.
I'm sure Katie is taking notes too, but I am as well, Lee, and we would love to have a presentation on that. It's so important. Let's see, I see Gina Boss has her hand raised. Go ahead, Gina.
Yes, I do. I thought I'd just give a couple of announcements related to CTS for folks. So the first is, you know, we, rather than holding our all councils meeting and our annual meeting and awards luncheon in February, we postponed those both to May in the hopes of being able to meet in person. Well, given the current public health guidance, we've determined that we will not be able to have those events in person. We will be holding an all councils meeting in May. So there will be, which will feature presentations and likely a panel discussion. So we'll be providing more information to all of you at a later time for that. We will also be hosting a separate awards celebration virtually in May, and likely the week of May 17th. So again, that's an opportunity for us to acknowledge recipients of the Research Partnership Award, which is named after our former director, Bob Johns. So highlighting partnerships within research, student achievements and accomplishments here at the university, as well as professional 4 awards that highlight professional accomplishment. So more details to come on that. The other thing I'd like to announce is that CTS has launched within the university a new program for connected and automated vehicles called the MnCav ecosystem. And one exciting thing we have coming up in April, we were able to secure funding for an automated highway speed vehicle. So in April, we will be accepting delivery of, it's a Chrysler Pacifica, which will be outfitted with connected and automated vehicle technology. And we're excited because there is an initial project that's been funded by MnDOT and the local road research board that will make use of that vehicle. So much more to come on the MnCav ecosystem, but just wanted to have a chance to share that information as well.
Thank you, Gina. Let's see, others who have an update. Maybe I'll just note, I'm sure many of you are aware that USDOT has issued their notice of funding offer for the infra grant program. And then also we are expecting the NOFO for the build program any day. Those both include some new grant criteria that are a signature of this administration, things like resiliency, climate change adaptation, as well as environmental justice. So some important things for us to be paying attention to here in Minnesota as well as across the country. Other things that on the transit side of the world, the 5339 grants are also available. NOFO is also out, and that is available from the federal partners as well. Lisa, anything that you want to mention from the MnDOT side, even the research programs that you guys have going on right now?
Yeah, thanks. I was just getting ready to raise my hand. So thanks, Mary. Just a couple of things for those of you at MnDOT and not at MnDOT. We're in the process of gathering ideas for the next round of MnDOT funding. So that seems a long way off. Those projects wouldn't be selected until the fall of 21 and funded in the July of 22. So a long way out. But right now, MnDOT's taking ideas in what we call our idea scale system. So if you're a MnDOT person and you have an idea for a research project, please submit it. And if you're not from MnDOT, tell one of your MnDOT colleagues so they can put it in. I think there are some others that do have access to that ideal scale system. So I think the university folks have ideas too. And then some of the projects that were recently funded in the last round, one of them that I'm pretty excited about is a project with Yingling Fan and some other of her colleagues called Centering in the Margins, and it's a transportation equity project that will be doing both qualitative and quantitative research on groups of folks that are typically underserved by the transportation systems. So they'll do in-depth interviews and then travel diaries for up to 20 communities around the state. So it could be a community of color, it could be on a tribal land, it could be aging population in a rural community, but you know, any communities of people that aren't served well by the traditional transportation systems. And again, that research project will start in July, but we're gathering the technical advisory panel and the final scope of work for the project. So thanks, Mary. That's all the updates I can think about.
Great, Lisa. Let's see. I'm looking through the participant list. I see that we have a couple folks from cities. Would anyone from a city want to volunteer and let us know what is on your minds right now in terms of planning an economy for transportation? I also see some county folks. Anyone want to share a local perspective? And again, this is not something you have to have prepared. Feel free to respond to what you've heard us discuss today or to share anything that's on your mind. You also heard from Lee earlier, suggestions for future presentations. So that is also something that we would love to hear from you all right now. If you've heard some great presentations given in other venues that you think we should really benefit from discussing here at the CTS Planning and Economy Council, especially if it involves our university researchers, feel free to let us know that today or at any time, and we're always welcoming ideas. Let's see, I also see a couple folks from Met Council. Anyone from Met Council want to give an update? No? All right, going once, going twice. Well, if not, then thank you so much for joining us today. Like we said at the beginning, this presentation has been recorded and we will be posting it as well as the slides on the CTS's website. So look for that there, and always feel free to reach out to Katie or Gina or Lisa or myself if you would like to get a copy of those and can't find them on the CTS website. And again, very special thank you to Camilla, to your research team for this important research and for sharing it with us today. Have a great day, everybody.